I think that like everything that we do in life is cumulative. It's all building off of your previous experiences. And I feel really lucky that I've had a lot of really fantastic experiences to build off of and reference. Um, and that the work that I do has, honestly, I think I'm a better professional and I'm better at my job at Photos of Tomorrow because of the jobs I've had before.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Oh My Curry Goodness. My name is Hamza Islam. On this podcast, I talk to some of the most interesting Gen Zers about their story and the experiences that have shaped them into the person they are today. One of my goals for this podcast is for my guests to talk about how they overcame different obstacles and challenges to get to where they are today. Because while it is great to talk about all the amazing things, it's important to talk about the challenges because ultimately, while challenges and obstacles vary from person to person, having the right mindset to overcome them is very important. And while I want to talk about the challenges and obstacles a person faces and how to overcome them, I also want to talk to my guests as human beings. Because when we get the honest or when we get the most honest and authentic version of a person, it allows them to share their story in a very unique way. And at a time where we grew up in social media where everything seems like it's all rainbows and great things. That's not really true. It's further from the truth. And so I want my podcast to be about overcoming challenges and just seeing people as human beings. So I hope you continue to support this podcast and continue to be inspired by some of the most amazing people who are doing incredible things. Now, this week, I'm speaking with Marianna Pecora, who is the communications director at Voters of Tomorrow. And this organization is a Gen Z led movement that engages, educates, and represents young people, young Americans in politics. I first heard about Marianna because from a interesting, if you say, interesting interaction with a U.S. representative. And while it was a year ago when this happened, and we can talk more about it, I thought it was really important because it talked about some of the things that may be unpopular, such as being liked or not being afraid or not being afraid to face your fears in whatever way. But we'll get more into that. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Mariana Pecora, thank you so much for joining Oh My Curry Goodness.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it was so cool. So I'll spoil the movie. You had an interesting interaction with U.S. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I remember watching or seeing or reading the article. And when I heard that you were interested in joining the podcast, I was like, why does this name sound familiar? Oh, it's you.
Yeah, a little bit of a crazy moment that happened a year ago. Right after I moved to DC, I had been here for about 3 weeks, and that was sort of like my introduction to the city. So, um, fascinating little interaction there.
I definitely want to get into it, but one of the things I want to talk about is obviously you consider yourself as an activist, part of activism, and especially when it comes to um, politics in the United States. I've had some weird interactions, and when I say weird, I mean when it comes to the idea of activism. And I spoke with a previous guest. His name is Zane Landon. He's a mental health activist, and we one of the things that came into mind when I think of activism is there are going to be people that may not like you because of what you're representing. And that's something I want to talk about later on, kind of tying into your interaction with Marjorie Taylor Greene. But another thing that I think a lot of people think of when it comes to activism is standing up for something, regardless of how big or small. And I want to ask you, do you remember the first time? It doesn't matter how big or small, it can just be anything. Do you remember the first time you remember standing up for something? And do you remember how that made you feel? Because I'm trying to think right now, like I don't remember the last time I stood up for something just because I either thought it was like the most unpopular thing or maybe because maybe I just don't have a good memory. But for you, do you remember what that moment was like?
Yeah, I think the easiest reference point I have for this is the 2016 election. That election is a really big part of my story in politics and the way that I decided to work in politics really, even if I sort of didn't really know it at the time. I was born in 2003, very much a Gen Z, and I was in sixth grade at the beginning of the 2016 election. Um, I grew up in San Diego, California. My dad is Italian American. He grew up in Rochester, New York. My mom is Mexican American. She grew up in Tijuana, which is right over the border, like right across from San Diego. And she grew up really on both sides of the border, going to school in the US half the time, going to school in Mexico half the time. And I have a lot of family in Mexico, and it used to be sort of like a part of my like weekly ritual when I was living in California to go down to Tijuana and visit my grandma who was living there, or my aunts and my cousins. Um, and the 2016 election was the first time that I sort of realized that politics um, is like deeply personal, and the first time that I really paid attention to politics in any way, shape, or form. There's a siren going by. I'm gonna wait just a second longer to keep going. Um, okay, cool. But anyways, I like that election was really formative to my political ideology and my understanding of the way that American politics works. Because I mean, I was like 12. I honestly didn't really know what a Democrat was or what a Republican was, who the like what the different parties stood for. But I did know that what Donald Trump was saying was wrong. And I did know that the attacks that he was making against immigrants, against specifically like Mexican immigrants, people that are working really, really hard um, to help our country and want to be here. Um, the way he was talking about Mexican immigrants was like deeply personally offensive to me. Um, and I think that was the first time that I understood that politics really can have an impact on people.
Yeah, I think if I'm trying to remember correctly, I was probably eighth, ninth grade when the 2016 election happened. And it's weird. Even today, I'm not involved in politics just because I think politics can be a very confusing conversation because it's like this person said this person said that. And so there's a lot of confusion. And I'm glad that you found your, when I say your voice, I mean something that you were like really passionate about when it came to the election. I find that, and I don't know if this is something that you relate to indirectly or directly, but growing up, I feel like politics wasn't talked about as much just because I guess the worst case scenario can always exist and whatever that may be. Like the moment you start speaking out about something, you might get ridiculed in one way or another. So I want to ask you in this case, like, how do you know which side is right and which side is wrong? Because I think it's like you're either on the left or not left and the right, but it's like you're either choice A or choice B, and then there's like a lot of people in the middle that's like trying to figure out which one to go with. But it almost feels like there's like a sense of like there's like strengths and weaknesses for choice A and then strengths and weaknesses of choice B, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it sort of goes to um, like end goals and how to get to them. I consider myself to be like a pretty liberal person. Like I am comfortable calling myself a progressive. Um, but there's a lot of times where like the progressive policy, it can't happen in the way that we want it to. If doing the things that we wanted to do were that easy, elections wouldn't matter. But like like the I don't know, not elections wouldn't matter. They would still matter. But like uh politics would be a whole lot easier. There wouldn't be all this conversation, there wouldn't be so much drama. Um, but there's also like a reason that it's difficult to pass stuff. Like it's sort of built into our system. Um, but like a really good example of this, I think, is in in um in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a provision to allow Medicare to negotiate the price of prescription drugs. it was something that I thought was a really big deal, that I thought was really important and exciting and helpful to the American people. And I am a big fan of making Medicare and like medical access easier to easier and cheaper for Americans. But this one provision of the bill to allow Medicare to negotiate the price of prescription drugs, Joe Manchin wasn't going to vote for it, and Republicans obviously weren't going to vote for it either. So there were three Democrats that voted against this amendment for the bill, and one of them was my representative Scott Peters, who I interned for. He's pretty much like a moderate in the like House of Representatives. He's a Democrat though. Um, so three of these Democrats voted against this provision. And of those three Democrats, Scott Peters was the only one that had a different option, like a different version of that specific piece of the bill. And his version of it essentially had some like subsidies for the prescription drug companies that would go to research and development, which is a big part of the like economy in San Diego, and also kept the same provision, like kept the same benefits for the American people. And a lot of people were really, really angry with him about that. But I actually think that's one of his biggest accomplishments as a member of the House of Representatives, because that specific provision and the way that he introduced that not only kept the same benefits for the American people, but made it a version of the bill that Joe Manchin was willing to vote for. And the Inflation Reduction Act was this like really just life-changing bill for a lot of Americans, and it wouldn't have happened in the way that it did without that one provision.
Yeah, and I think kind of going back to what you were saying about trying to do the right thing, I think it's just one of those things where it's like it's definitely a gut feeling, and at the same time, it's I don't know if you can. I think regardless of what you do, no matter how popular or unpopular something is, I think it's just a matter of accepting that not a lot of people will like it, but it's one of those like it's like you need to understand as soon as possible, because if you don't understand it, then people are going to be affected in one way or another. Um, I want to talk about the beginning. I want to go back to the beginning, and I know you got involved, or a lot of what you do now was inspired by the 2016 election. But growing up, did you ever find yourself doing something else? Because, or did you ever feel like, did you have other like, no, I don't want to say dreams or aspirations. That sounds cringy. But like, did you ever have anything else that you wanted to do, or was activism something you just the moment you heard about this word, this was something you wanted to do um, from the beginning?
I never intended to be an activist. That was never one of my goals. It was never sort of like on my list. Um, and I don't know if I consider myself an activist like to the full extent of the word. There are a whole lot of other people doing um, a lot more sort of like outward facing activism than I am. Um, but when I was growing up, I was always, I think, ambitious. Um, I've always been a driven person. I always have like wanted to work really hard, but there was a really long time where I didn't know. I had absolutely no clue where to sort of focus my ambition and my work. Um, there was a period of time where I thought I was going to go to fashion school. I thought I was going to go to art school. I thought I was going to be like an antique dealer, interior designer, or something. Like I had so many journeys before I ended up working in politics. Um, and art is something that I was kind of like raised with and that I really care about, and that is sort of like a hobby that I keep on the side now. But yeah, that there was a really, really long time where I didn't know what I wanted to be or what I wanted to do. And even though the 2016 election was the election that sort of like shaped my political awareness and made politics something that sort of entered my like vision as something that like was possible. The 2020 election is what actually sort of got me engaged and involved and like volunteering and working in politics for the first time. So I think that was kind of like in part a result of the pandemic and in part a result of like this immense feeling of dread of like not being old enough to vote in that election, but understanding that it was really, really important and the stakes were really, really high. Um, and that kind of just like took off from there. I am still like a little bit shocked and surprised of the way that things have turned out and the way that I got to where I am. But none of it was planned.
Yeah, I think that's what can be sometimes funny in the sense that like nothing gets planned, and you can try to prepare as much as possible, but then there's always some sort of like curveball that makes everything confusing. Um, and I think one thing you mentioned how growing up you would say that you were more like a very like a driven, ambitious person, and somewhat related to it's something I can relate to in a way because I was a very curious person. I was not afraid to like ask stupid questions. But now as I get older, now I get to college, it's like maybe it's best to not ask a stupid question just because out of judgment. But I often found myself like I'm in the same boat as you. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do when I grew up. I just held on to that one specific trait was my curiosity. And um I still don't know. I mean, I'm someone studying computer science, so I guess like in a way I'm curious about like how a computer works and what is the right stuff. But I also find a lot of interest in people as well. So I think in a way I'm glad that we found what we do, politics for yourself, podcasting and computer science for myself. And I think even though there are things that there are certain characteristics and traits that carry with you for a long time, whether that be driven, ambitious, curiosity. There are also traits that you can pick up because of things that you are into. So, an interesting thing is even though I have a podcast, I also my because of this podcast, I have overcome my fear in a way of talking to people because I started this in January of 2023, but if you had met me anytime earlier, I would have been the type of person that would be really scared and hesitant to like to have a conversation with people. And here I am meeting with people, here I am getting to interact with people all over the city, country, and even globally. I want to ask you, as when now that you're part of Voters of Tomorrow, what are some specific traits and characteristics that you've picked up that you may not have picked up if it wasn't for this organization?
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to something you said a little bit earlier for a second. I think, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, I got asked that question so many times throughout my childhood. I think it's the dumbest question in the world. We should stop asking kids that because, like, I had absolutely no clue what I wanted to do or who I wanted to be when I was 10. I got told like so many times. My dad is a lawyer. He does personal injury law. It's like car accidents, trip and falls, like the I don't want to say most boring things because like it matters, but like it's really not that interesting. Workers' comp, talking to insurance companies, no thank you. But everyone always told me growing up, you should be a lawyer like your dad. And I was like, absolutely not. I don't want to do that. I've hung out with him in his office and that's not for me. Um, so I think we should really stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up because what you were saying about picking up skills along the way in your life, that's exactly how it works. Like, again, I didn't plan for my life to look the way that it does. It looked the way that it does because I picked up skills along the way and I've brought things that I learned in one job to another. I've learned from people that I look up to in other aspects of my life and taken their ideas about the world and brought them into my work in politics. My dad being one of them. So I definitely picked up a bunch of skills on my way to Voters of Tomorrow. And I've definitely picked up a bunch of skills at Voters of Tomorrow that I'll use down the line in the future when I'm working in another job. I think that like everything that we do in life is cumulative. It's all building off of your previous experiences. And I feel really lucky that I've had a lot of really fantastic experiences to build off of and reference. Um, and that the work that I do has, like, honestly, like, I think I'm a better professional and I'm better at my job at Voters of Tomorrow because of the jobs I've had before.
Okay, wait, I really want to go back to what you just said about what you want to be when you grow up. So I know you talked about how I think your dad is Italian and your mom is or like Italian ancestry, and your dad had or your mom had I can't speak today. Your dad has Italian ancestry and your mom has Mexican ancestry. How and I don't know, you can be as open and honest as possible about this, but like when growing up, how did people tell you, well, how did they define success to you? Because as someone who is South Asian, we're told the Fantastic Four. So science, technology, engineering, math. Oh, actually, not Fantastic Four because there's lawyer, there's doctor. So basically, like, six things you can do, or you're considered a failure. So there's a lot of pressure on as for me to be like to have like the to be the best interviewer in some sense because it's like we've never seen anything like that. So growing up, like how did people, whether it be in the Mexican community or Italian community, define success for you?
That's a like really interesting question. I had really fantastic parents who sort of allowed me to define success in what I was doing in my own ways. I went to like a really like proper prep school. I was always sort of like academically ambitious, but I had a lot of friends that like faced similar academic pressures that you're talking about right now, or like face pressures from their parents to like be a certain thing when they grow up, to study a certain thing in college, to get into a certain type of college. Um, and my parents really let me shape my future in the way that I wanted to. Like they let me choose to go to the school that I went to. They let me choose my classes when I was there. Um, they always like wanted to have some input and to like help guide me, but they never sort of like forced me into a particular thing. They let me choose my college. They let me choose my career path. And so I feel like I've been given a lot of autonomy in defining my own career and my own future. And it's something that I'm really, really grateful for from my parents because I know that not everybody gets that. Um, but I think that they were both given a similar amount of autonomy and like time and space to figure out what they wanted to be and what they wanted to do and who they wanted to be. Um, and I think they really valued that too. Like my mom, she she went to fashion school, and she had a line for a bit that was like sold in small stores around Southern California. She ended up sort of like working like corporate side and like retail management, but that was like a path that she chose and that she wanted to be a part of. My dad says that he went to law school because he finished college and didn't know what to do next, and it was just like something he could do. Um, so I think that they both really valued the fact that they were allowed to sort of shape their own paths, and they wanted to give that to me, and it's something that I really, really value.
I think And I think if there's something that your parents and my parents have in common, which is that they're very supportive. So like growing up, it was the same thing. It wasn't necessarily my parents were like, you need to do this. It was more community based. So I remember when I told people, I remember this one of my dad's friends asked me, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? And I was like, oh, not this question again. And then I said, and at the time I had a lot of interest in psychology, and I said that, and then I attracted one of my dad's friends telling me, "Oh no, no, you better not do this. You got to go into computer science." And I'm like, all right, I'll do it." And now I mean, I like computer science. Don't get me wrong, but at the time, it was one of those where it's like, okay, I have to do this, not I want to do this, and those are two different mindsets to have. And my dad said, are you sure you want to study psychology?" And then I thought, well, at the time, I had a really weird misconception of psychology. I thought if you study psychology, that means you're able to overcome your fears. And I have a horrible fear of spiders, so I'm like, I don't think I'd make sense. But I've learned that's not the case. But um, speaking of speaking of sometimes attracting the wrong crowd, in a sense, I know that as someone who's a part of Voters of Tomorrow, you will meet with representatives, politicians to talk about how to make change, to how to make your communities better. But there's also times where, and it's not just your interaction with Marjorie Taylor Greene, but it can be anyone else, where you have an interaction, a maybe negative, more so negative experience, people will see that and go, look at all these annoying people trying to harass representatives, instead of looking at it as, oh, these people are trying to have a conversation about how to improve different communities. And I've talked a lot about this on many episodes about intention, because people will see you and go, okay, you're acting like this, but you know yourself better than everyone else, in the sense that you're not trying to be seen as like some annoying pest or whatever. It's you're someone who's advocating for change. And unfortunately, when you're little, and I was having a conversation with my friend, which is, when you're little, you want to be liked by everybody, but then as you get older, you start to have people that may not like you, even people that you kind of grew up with. So I know it's still a challenge, and it's obviously easier said than done, but are you at peace at knowing that when you're part of a organization, when it comes to advocating for young people in the United States, like Voters of Tomorrow, are you at peace with the fact that you will always have someone hating you, either whether it's your policies or just you in general?
Yeah, that's been like a challenging aspect of it. Not gonna lie, after the Marjorie Taylor Greene thing, some pretty nasty comments in my DMs on Twitter, some pretty nasty people coming after me. But I also think that like as much as I love the work that I'm doing and love the people I get to work with, uh like it's really hard to be the youngest person in the room a lot of times. And I think like Voters of Tomorrow collectively experiences this. Like we're here, a lot of us are here in DC now. We walk into an event and we are the youngest people in the room. And sometimes it's really hard to get taken seriously as the youngest person in the room. I think sometimes even harder than like dealing with people that don't like you or disagree with you is dealing with people who probably do agree with you but won't take you seriously. Um, I've seen an improvement in it actually. Like it's actually been really inspiring and really um sort of like helped my self-confidence in the last year to see the changing attitudes when I walk into a room full of like the conventional wisdom of politics, a room full of sort of like Gen Xers and up. Um, and to see the reaction and the reception to having a couple of kids in the room, watching that change has been really inspiring. But it's not easy to be the 19-year-old in the room full of like late 40s, 50-year-olds, um, and walk up to somebody and say, hey, I have a pitch for you. Like, hey, I want you to help me on this thing. Hey, I want you to do this. Um, it's not. It's really, really hard sometimes. Um, and I really respect the people that do take young people seriously. Um, I also understand the people that don't sometimes. But it's also, it's just, it's given me a new outlook on the way that we treat young people in a lot of different spaces. Um, it's given me so much more respect for people my age, even. Who can be the youngest person in any room.
Yeah, and there's two questions I want to ask you. The first one is, having difficult conversations, especially in politics, is a challenge because you guys have different views on a specific topic. And now the most difficult thing is, how do you find a compromise? And it's funny, like I forget, there was one person, I listened to his stuff, but he said learning about having difficult conversations is more important in life than learning about trigonometry, because that's an important life skill. Oh, I remember, it's Simon Sinek, best known for his book Start With Why. And so I know this is another example where it's like it's easier said than done, because when you're talking to someone who thinks different from you, I mean, it's challenging because you do, like, it's like it's the best thing because you're able to find a compromise, but it's also a challenge in the moment. So how do you try to have a difficult, because I think this is something that when anyone that goes into politics, they fall into this trap. And I know a lot of, sometimes like when elections happen, I'll see this, the most common Instagram post I'll see is, we can disagree and still be friends. but that's such a very broad term. So from your experience, or just in general, how do you follow that, like, we can disagree but still be quote unquote friends? Or how do we still like try to talk to each other despite our despite that our views are still different?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the way that I grew up, the way that I handled difficult conversations. Um, my household wasn't really a political household. My dad is like very much an independent. My mom, I think, is currently a registered Republican, but hasn't voted for one in a really long time. But the conversations in my house, like at the dinner table, were like very, very infrequently about politics until until it became my job and I started making them about politics. Um, but I'm also an only child, and so that meant that a lot of times, like I was sitting at a table full of adults when I was a kid. My parents are also like older than most. Um, and so they would like bring me out to dinner with their friends and stuff like that. And so I think that from a really young age, I learned to sort of uh, like have a stake in the conversation and get my voice heard a little bit. But I think the important thing in having like respectful but disagreeing dialogue um, is always like, in my perspective, I always try to understand where the other person is coming from. And I always try to treat their views with the respect and sort of like weight that I think they deserve. Um, I think it kind of just goes back to like what they teach you in kindergarten, like treat people the way that you want to be treated. Um, I'm never gonna aim disrespect at someone specifically because of their political beliefs if they're like a civilian. I'm more than willing to go after an elected official for their political beliefs, especially if it's something that I think like doesn't really represent the people that they do. Um, that I think is something appropriate to do. Like that's an opportunity to be disrespectful for someone that you agree with or you disagree with. Like I think there's sort of like a feeling that like everyone has to have their voice heard on every issue. Everyone has to have a take on everything. You have to like do your Instagram activism and post your story with like your deepest, darkest feelings and share it with the world. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't ask that of any person my age. I don't ask that of myself. Uh, the people that I ask that of are elected officials because that's their job.
Speaking of elected officials, let's talk about Marjorie
Let's
Taylor
talk
US
about it. Let's talk
US.
about it.
I don't want to talk too much about it, but for those who are interested, I'll make sure to add the link below about your interesting interaction. But essentially, you were trying to talk to her about, I think it was gun reform. It may have been, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what happened was she apparently or actually kicked you, and because she was like,
Yep.
"Oh, you're in my way" and stuff. And I don't want to talk about what that experience like. I don't want to talk about like what that moment meant. Well, actually, no, I want to talk about it. Um, when you're in that moment, I think there are a lot of politicians, and I hope she doesn't come after me because I'm not trying to pick sides, but I think oftentimes there can sometimes be like a comedic moment in the sense that you can look back and reflect and be like, that was an interesting moment. I don't think using the word comedic makes sense, but it's more like an interesting and like I got kicked. This is like something I'll remember. There's that element, and then there's also fear because you are talking to someone who disagrees with you, and kind of talking about how when the news came out about your interaction, you were getting hateful messages. At that moment, were you more, when you look back at that moment, were you more like, wow, I actually got kicked? And it was more of like, I don't want to say comedic, but it's like, it was like a surprising element, like an oh my curry goodness moment? Or was it more of like out of fear, like I got kicked, like something worse could happen?
I think that the biggest thing that came up for me was an understanding of the respect that Marjorie Taylor Greene has for constituents, which is little to none, in my opinion. Um, like the biggest takeaway that I had from that is that this is an elected official who is willing to treat a group of young people with such utter disregard and disrespect. Um, like there have really been few moments in my life where I've like come across people that I feel like really couldn't care if I lived or died. Um, and that was one of them. It was like I was more than anything, honestly, just like shocked by her lack of empathy, her lack of humanity, um, the ability, because I also like we watched the video, I think I was having a pretty respectful conversation with her. Like I was really doing my best to have like a productive dialogue. Um, and to be treated with such disrespect, and not even on a personal level. Like the group of voters of Toronto that were there that day, we were there because we were working with members of Congress to advocate for a package of bills that were oriented towards helping young Americans. Um, and the disrespect for that work and that time and that effort, as well, I think is just like really appalling. And I think it's also like we had just left a roundtable with the House Rules Committee. We had just left a meeting where, like, in the Capitol building, where we sat down in front of members of Congress and we said, "This is what we want. This is what's supported by young Americans. This is what you can do to help us." And they were more than willing and wanted to be there having that conversation with us. And then to leave that meeting and to face the exact opposite reaction was just like completely and like utterly heartbreaking. Like it's disappointing. No elected official should be treating people that way. No elected official should have such an utter disregard for their constituents. Um, that's the way that I feel about it.
I find that it goes kind of goes back to that broad term, which is that we can disagree and still be quote unquote friends. And obviously, I'm gonna be assuming you and Marjorie Taylor Greene are not friends, but I think it's one of those things where it's like, yes, you might disagree on a lot of things, but there's still a line that you cannot cross. And if you're comfortable answering this question, if you were to meet, if you were to meet U.S. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene either today, tomorrow, or whenever, what would that conversation look like? Because I often feel like because of those experiences, I think it's one thing to maybe talk about politics, but then it's also like you mentioned how it's like she didn't treat you as a normal human being. So what if you were to have like a little like one-on-one session with her, what would that conversation look like?
That's a challenging question. I honestly would probably be even more interested in like a sort of like off-camera conversation with her, and like I would want to like treat her with respect and be a civil person and ask civil questions, um because that's the way that I that's the way that I am. um I would be curious to see her response though. There's an extent to which like I kind of felt like in that moment she was sort of putting on a show for the cameras because she knew that she was being recorded. She knew the whole thing was being recorded. She posted the video on her Twitter later in the day. Um, but I am always curious of what people like that was such a big profile are like when you kind of like turn the cameras off and get them in private. And I've had some really great experiences and I've had some not so great ones. Um, but yeah, I would want to see what she was like in a less like public conversation.
Would you ever forgive her for the things she did to you? Because here's the thing, and I'm not saying this because I have to, although I do say this a lot, but I'm saying it because I'm genuinely interested. Like I know you come across as a very nice person, very generous person, and you even just said that yourself. But because of that event and what the reaction was like and just that experience itself, would you ever forgive her, or do you feel like that memory is still there, but in a more but that negative memory is still there, and it's going to be hard for you to it's going to be hard for you to like forgive her because of what that moment meant for you?
Um, that's a interesting question, but like I really don't think that like my forgiveness is what Marjorie Taylor Greene should be seeking. Like I honestly think that that moment is just like an example of her character and a reflection on her, but there's like so many like ridiculous and terrifying things that she has said time and time again over her years as a member of Congress, like from like blatant anti-Semitism to like just like really, really harmful things, election denying, um, uh, like an active part in trying to like overthrow our government. Um, that's what I'm more concerned about with her than like for than her forgiveness on this like one particular like kind of tiny, ultimately inconsequential thing. Um, yeah, I like I don't think I've ever like I'm not asking for an apology from her. I in part because I don't think I'll get one, but like I really don't like I don't want to say I don't care about her, but like it could matter less to me if she apologized or not, or if she was regretful of what she did or not. I think there's so many more things that she should be like taking care of and paying attention to. One of them being her own sort of moral compass and the way that she represents her constituency. And those are things that matter way more to me.
Yeah, I think I know what you're trying to say in this case, because it's like I think it would be nice, but there are maybe things that she may have gone out of line, and it's like you probably need to fix all this. I think it's nice to
Yeah,
like this is like it's like I don't want to say like well no, I think like
like
getting an apology is more of like an icing on the cake for you. Like there's like that little cherry on the top, but you gotta like to make the whole cake, it's like you gotta do all this. I don't know, that was a terrible analogy, but like,
yeah, I don't even think that's it. I think it's just like I like forgiveness is not something that's like crossed my radar with her, but it's also like I don't want to say I don't care about that event because it was definitely like important and like formative and like brought a lot of stuff my way. Like a lot of people kind of know who I am because of that. But like ultimately that was like a couple of days and a couple of interview questions in my life. Um, and to her, I think it's so much more of a reflection of her broader character and her disrespect for people. Um, so I don't think it really had enough impact on me to be something that like I'm seeking forgiveness for.
couple of questions before I let you go. The first thing I want to talk about is overcoming fear. And specifically, we talked about obviously the experience you had, and then the idea that then the topic of not caring about what other people think, which is unfortunately a thing in politics. What advice would you give? And I know I know the idea of overcoming fear is different from person to person because maybe someone who's involved in civics, education, or politics, their definition of overcoming fear may be different from maybe an athlete, entrepreneur, whatever that may be. But in terms of the broader scale, when it comes to not being afraid to speak up about things, not caring about what other people think, what advice would you give to people when it comes to overcoming that fear that, and not necessarily like not fear of this. I was gonna say like overcoming that like fear of rejection, failure, these kinds of things. What advice would you give to people when it comes to like overcoming those like small challenges? Because, well, actually, I take that back. That's not a small challenge. That's a ginormous challenge. But nevertheless, like, what advice would you give to people when it comes to like overcoming fear from kind of like your perspective?
It's something that I wake up and do every day. Like it never goes away. I continuously deal with imposter syndrome. I wonder why I get let into the rooms that I'm let into, why the people that respect me do. Um, every day is a challenge in that sense. But I also sort of just like encourage people to think about the fact that like if you're in the room, you're in the room for a reason, or if someone's asking for your help, that means that they want it. I am actively dealing with fear of failure on a daily basis. And I also think like a big part of what's helped me come to terms with it is like realizing that the worst thing that happens is you fail. Like, I think um, there's been plenty of things that like I haven't done well in my life, or plenty of things that like I really like I messed it up. I did. Um, and I think that realizing that like failure isn't that bad and like everyone does it sometimes um is an important part of that. Like I always consider, I mean, sometimes it's a scary exercise, but like I always make myself consider like what the absolute worst case scenario of a problem is. And when you kind of like think about that and come to terms with it, I think a lot of times it's sort of just like easier to handle it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Excuse
I
me.
think that's
Um, but
no, go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, like coming to terms with the worst case scenario has like sometimes made it be like, oh, I'm actually kind of okay if that happens. Like, that's fine.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. Like, I think once you ask yourself, like, what is the worst possible thing, maybe you feel better about it because it's probably not as bad as you think. The last thing I want to talk about before I let you go is you described yourself in the beginning how you're a very ambitious, driven person, and obviously there's still a lot more things to do in the future. But let's talk about that for a little bit. Like, what are some of the things you want to do in the future? And of course, again, like you talked about this, and you said it was really well said, which is anything can happen in life. It's especially like you can prepare for something and then something completely random happens. But nevertheless, if you were to like look at some of the things that you really want to do, what are those things?
There's a lot of stuff I want to do. Over the summer, I was working on the Hill at the House Democratic Women's Caucus, doing some digital stuff for them. I really enjoyed that experience, and I want to go back to the Hill at some point in my life. Working in government was really exciting for me, and it was the first time that I was doing sort of official side work. Um, I want to work on campaigns in the future. I would love to be back in DC at some point in my life. And I would also love to be sort of like hopping around the country and getting to know new communities of people and new parts of the country that I haven't seen before. But like, I really don't have a plan. I can't tell you what's next in a year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, um, because I don't know. Like I'm kind of seeing where life and my career takes me. But I've also had a pretty good time so far, sort of just like letting the opportunities that I have carry me to the places that they do. And I plan on doing that for the next couple of years at least.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great answer, right? Because there's so many things that can happen, but no
Yeah,
matter
I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's happening next week, and I don't know what's happening in a month, and I don't know what's happening in a year and a half, or 3 years, or 5 years.
That's true. But I guess whatever you do, I'm sure you're going to do a lot of incredible things. And I know you're going to inspire many people. And even if you have people that don't like you, unfortunately, that's part of the plan, but you just got to keep going. But Mariana, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It was really great talking to you. I wish you nothing but the best, and I hope we get to meet in person. And hopefully, we can do another episode. Hopefully, the next time you have an interaction with someone, it's not you being kicked on or crapped on. But never, it was still great talking to you, and I can't wait to see all the great things you do.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for having me, and let me know if you're ever in DC.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you guys like what you saw, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at the OMCG Podcast for more information on guests, preview clips, and more. Please continue to support this podcast in the future, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next episode.